A storm gathers over the quiet village of Bibury. In the grand halls of Ashford Manor, whispers of scandal echo louder than the wind. A young woman, forced into marriage to save her family's name, stands trembling beneath the gaze of a husband she does not know, and a world that has already judged her. But behind the cold stone walls, secrets burn hotter than fire, and one forbidden kiss will shatter every lie. Welcome to a story of love, redemption, and courage in the face of cruelty. Subscribe now and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you unforgettable period romances filled with passion, mystery, and heart. Bibury, the Cotswolds, England, 1813. The carriage wheels sang a tired song over the gravel lane, as if even the road were weary of delivering strangers into a village that already knew how it would judge them. Josephine Hargreaves sat very still, hands folded over a reticule that had once belonged to her mother, the silk worn thin where anxious fingers had worried it. Through the small, slightly fogged window, she saw honey-coloured stone cottages huddled like secrets, their roofs softened by moss, their gardens disciplined with winter greens and stubborn late blooms. A ribbon of river cut through the village like a bright vein, and the air carried the clean smell of damp earth and distant sheep. Bibury looked like a place where nothing truly wicked could survive. Josephine knew better. The driver slowed near the inn, and the moment the horses stopped, she felt it, even before the door opened. The sensation of eyes, the quiet shift of attention, the invisible tightening that happened in small towns when someone new arrived, someone whose name had travelled ahead of her like a shadow. When the footman lowered the step, Josephine placed one gloved hand on the doorframe and stepped down. Her boots touched the ground, and she lifted her chin the way she had taught herself to do in harder places than this. She wore a simple muslin gown in pale ivory, the empire waist tied with a modest ribbon beneath her bust. A dove-grey spencer warmed her shoulders, neat but plainly trimmed. Her straw bonnet was practical rather than charming, its ribbon a shade too subdued to flirt with fashion. She did not dress to be seen, and yet she had never felt more watched. A woman at the inn doorway paused mid-sweep, broom frozen. Two girls crossing the lane slowed as if caught by surprise, then recovered and giggled into their hands. A gentleman with a basket glanced up, looked too long, and looked away too late. It was not loud cruelty. It was the quiet kind that pretended innocence while it measured you, found you lacking, and enjoyed the finding. Josephine adjusted her grip on the reticule, careful. Her smile, when she offered it to the innkeeper who stepped out to greet her, rose unevenly at one side, a small betrayal of her body that always seemed to happen when she tried to be brave. "Miss Hargreaves," the innkeeper said, and there was a strange emphasis on the name, as though he had practiced it. "Welcome. We have your room prepared." "Thank you," Josephine replied. Her voice was soft, but not timid. She had learned that timidity was an invitation. He called for a lad to take her trunk. The trunk looked smaller than it should have for a woman about to become a marchioness, and Josephine felt the sting of that too. There had been more once. More gowns, more gloves, more small luxuries that had made her feel like a person of her station. There had been a father too, but life had a way of stripping a family down to what the world would allow them to keep. Inside, the inn was warm with hearth smoke and the scent of baked bread. Josephine heard voices, felt them soften as she passed, felt them pick up again behind her with the eager rustle of curiosity. "She's the one," someone murmured. "Ashford's bride," another voice replied, amused and sharp. Josephine did not turn. She climbed the stairs as if she had not heard. She had been the subject of whispers in London drawing rooms when her family's fortune began to crumble. But there, at least, whispers were drowned by 100 other scandals. Here in Bibury, a whisper had nowhere to go but into every ear. Her room was modest, clean. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender. On the small table by the window sat a vase with winter greenery, as if someone had tried to make it pretty, without knowing what pretty meant to a woman whose life had been reduced to endurance. Josephine removed her gloves slowly, smoothing each finger as though the act could calm her heart. She loosened her bonnet strings and set it aside. In the mirror, her face looked back at her with too much honesty. Hazel eyes warm but tired, freckles light across the bridge of a nose that had never quite healed straight, a mouth that could be gentle or stubborn depending on what she demanded of it. In London, men had turned away after one polite glance. Here people stared, not because they desired her, but because they could not imagine why anyone else would. She pressed her fingertips to the glass of the window, watching the lane below. A pair of women had paused near the inn sign. They spoke without looking up, yet Josephine knew she was the topic. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she allowed herself the smallest, most private admission. "I am afraid. Not of the marriage, not of the title, not even of the man whose name would soon be bound to hers, afraid of being humiliated where everyone can see." A knock came at the door. Josephine straightened at once, pulling her composure back around her like a shawl. A maid entered with a tray and a note. "This was delivered for you, miss." Josephine took the note. The paper was plain, the handwriting formal. She recognized it from correspondence with her guardian. Her appointment had been arranged. She was expected at Ashford Hall before dusk. The maid lingered, eyes bright with that same careful curiosity Josephine had felt downstairs. "It's a great honor," the girl said. And then, as if unable to help herself, she added, "It's a wonder, truly." Josephine looked at her calmly. "A wonder?" The maid flushed. "Begging your pardon, miss, I only meant, well, a Marquis." Josephine's uneven smile appeared again, but this time it was cooler. "Yes," she said softly, "a Marquis." The maid left quickly, chastened, and Josephine sat at the table with the untouched tea cooling near her hand. A wonder indeed. She could already hear the hidden sentence behind the girl's words. A Marquis, and you. Josephine rose, opened her trunk, and drew out the best gown she owned, a pale blue muslin with a simple sash. The fabric had been carefully mended at the seam. She touched the stitches, remembering her own fingers, bent over the needle in lamplight, making beauty from necessity. When she dressed, she did so with reverence, not vanity. She pinned her hair into a low bun, smoothing the chestnut waves into order, leaving only a soft tendril by her ear. She fixed her bonnet, tied the ribbon, and stared at herself again. "You will not break," she whispered to her reflection, as though speaking it aloud could make it true. "You will not give them that." The ride to Ashford Hall took her through lanes that curved like secrets between hills. Sheep dotted the fields like scattered clouds fallen to earth. Stone walls cut the land into neat promises. It was too beautiful, and Josephine felt a strange anger in her chest at the ease of it, at the way a landscape could look innocent, while people could be cruel. As the carriage approached the village centre, it slowed again. The lane narrowed. A small group of women stood near a shop window, hands full of ribbon and thread. They looked up at the sound of wheels and stopped talking at once. Josephine did not look away. She held their gaze through the glass. One of them, the oldest, frowned as if displeased that Josephine had dared to meet her eyes. Then the carriage passed, and Josephine exhaled only when they were behind her. Ashford Hall appeared at last, set back from the road, its stone softened by ivy, even in winter. It was not a towering palace, but a house built on certainty, on generations of ownership. The drive was lined with bare-branched trees that reached overhead like a formal corridor. A servant opened the carriage door. Josephine stepped down, and the cold bit her cheeks. She drew in a breath and walked forward, her skirts whispering softly at her ankles. Inside, the entrance hall was polished and still, the kind of stillness that felt maintained by discipline. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance. A fire murmured behind a grate, its warmth restrained as if even heat was expected to behave. A man approached, older than Josephine, impeccably dressed, his expression trained. Miss Hargreaves, I am Mr. Calthorpe, the steward. Lady Ashford is occupied at present, but the Marquis will receive you." The words made Josephine's stomach tighten, though she had heard them before in letters. The Marquis. She followed Mr. Calthorpe down a corridor lined with portraits. Men with proud gazes, women with pearls at their throats, their expressions composed as if emotion was a weakness to be avoided. Josephine felt herself shrinking beneath their painted scrutiny, and she forced her shoulders back. A door opened. Light spilled out, warm and gold. The library. She stepped inside, and for one suspended moment she forgot to breathe. He stood near the window, half turned away, one hand resting on the back of a chair. The afternoon light cut across him, illuminating the clean line of his jaw, the controlled elegance of his posture. He wore a dark tailcoat, perfectly fitted, and a waistcoat of muted ivory, a crisp white shirt, a cravat tied with the precision of a man who refused disorder in any form. He was handsome in the way the world loved to reward, tall, broad-shouldered, composed. Not boyish, not soft. A man whose face suggested he was accustomed to being admired and equally accustomed to not needing the admiration. When he turned, his eyes fixed on Josephine with a still intensity that made her feel transparent. Steel blue, she thought, startled. The Marquis studied her as if he were reading a letter written in a language he did not fully trust. "Miss Hargreaves," he said. "Lord Ashford," Josephine replied, and curtsied. He crossed the room with measured steps. Every movement suggested self-control. Yet as he neared, Josephine sensed something beneath it, like heat banked under ash. "Please," he said, gesturing toward a chair. "Sit." She did. Her gloves were back on, her fingers hidden, but her hand still trembled slightly in her lap. She hoped he would not notice. He sat opposite her, not too close, as if distance were safer. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, and Josephine felt the familiar danger of it. Silence was where people made assumptions. Silence was where they decided who you were, so she spoke first. "Thank you for receiving me." His gaze did not soften. "It is expected." The bluntness struck her, yet she recognized it as armor, not cruelty. A man who spoke in plain edges to keep emotion from bleeding through. "I understand," Josephine said quietly. "I do not intend to be a burden." Something flickered in his eyes. Not approval, not warmth, something more complicated, like displeasure at her choice of word. "A burden," he repeated, as if testing the taste of it. "Is that what you believe you would be?" Josephine's throat tightened. She could have lied. She could have performed. She could have said what women were taught to say, what would make men comfortable, but there was an exhaustion in her that refused to pretend. "I believe," she said slowly, "that your world has reasons for choosing women, beauty, fortune, connections, and I do not possess enough of those things to make anyone comfortable." The words hung between them, brave and dangerous. The Marquis's jaw tightened. He looked away briefly toward the window as if the landscape outside offered him something the room did not, control. When he looked back at her, his voice was lower. "You assume I chose you for comfort?" Josephine's heartbeat stumbled. "Did you not?" His fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair, a single betraying motion. "I chose," he said, and then paused, as if he had nearly said too much. "I agreed." The correction felt like a cold draught. Josephine swallowed. "Then we understand each other." His gaze returned to her face, lingering a fraction longer than it had before. It was not the gaze of a man admiring. It was the gaze of a man noticing, unwillingly, precisely, the slight crookedness of her nose, the small asymmetry of her smile, the quiet determination in her eyes. She felt suddenly exposed, as if her plainness had become something he could see in detail. "Bibury can be—" Josephine began, searching for a safe word. "Cruel," he finished, and the blunt honesty startled her. She blinked. "Yes." His eyes narrowed slightly. "It amuses itself. Small towns often do." Josephine's hands clenched in her lap beneath her reticule. "Then you are aware." He held her gaze. "I am aware." The air between them shifted, not warmer exactly, but charged, like a storm gathering without sound. Josephine's voice softened despite herself. "And yet, you still agreed." He was silent for a beat too long. Then very quietly he said, "I will not permit you to be publicly humiliated while you bear my name." The words should have sounded like duty. Instead, they sounded like a vow. Josephine's pulse rose. Her breath caught in her chest. She hated that her heart wanted to believe him, hated that hope, after so many years of being dismissed, felt like an ache. She forced herself to remain composed. "That is generous." His mouth tightened, as if he disliked the word generous even more than burden. He leaned forward slightly, and Josephine felt the movement like a physical pressure. "It is not generosity," he said. "It is necessity." There it was again. That careful avoidance of softness, that insistence on practical language. Josephine understood it too well. It was the way people spoke when they feared what tenderness might cost them. A sound interrupted them. The door opened, and a footman entered, carrying a silver tray. On it lay a sealed letter. "Pardon, my lord," the footman said. "This has just arrived." Josephine saw the change in the Marquis instantly. His entire body tightened, as if the air had sharpened. He rose and crossed the room in 3 controlled steps. He took the letter without hesitation, but his fingers gripped it too firmly. His eyes flicked to the seal. Something hard settled in his face, the way a storm cloud settles over sunlight. "Very well," he said, voice clipped. "Leave us." The footman withdrew. Josephine remained still, but her senses were suddenly awake in a way that had nothing to do with gossip. She watched the Marquis as he turned the letter in his hand once, as if considering whether to open it at all. Then he slid it into the inner pocket of his coat, neatly, decisively, as though hiding it could erase its existence. He turned back to her, and for the first time since she had entered the room, his composure looked like strain. Josephine's voice was careful. "Bad news?" His gaze sharpened, warning in it. "It is not a matter for discussion." The firmness would have offended a different woman. Josephine, who had learned to survive by reading what people refused to say, understood something else. That letter frightened him, and fear, in a man who had seemed carved of discipline, was far more unsettling than anger. Josephine rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. "Then I will not press." His shoulders eased by the smallest degree, as if restraint had become easier because she had offered him mercy. He hesitated, then stepped closer, as though some instinct drew him toward her despite himself. For a heartbeat, he stood near enough that Josephine could see the fine texture of his cravat, the faint shadow of fatigue at the edge of his eyes. His voice lowered. "You may find this house severe. My mother is exacting. The staff is loyal but cautious." "I am accustomed to caution," Josephine said. His eyes flicked to her gloved hands, still held tightly together. The tremor she had tried to hide returned, and she hated that he might see it. He reached out, not taking her hand, not yet. He simply touched the edge of her reticule, steadying it where it hung from her wrist, a gesture so small it could have been meaningless. But it was not meaningless to Josephine. His fingers brushed the silk. Not a caress, not an intimacy, just contact. And in that brief contact, Josephine felt the strange, dangerous truth of him. He was not indifferent. He was restrained. He drew his hand back as if he had touched fire. Josephine's throat tightened, and she forced herself to speak, to anchor the moment in something that would not make her reckless. "I will do my duty," she said, "because that was safe." His gaze met hers. "So will I." The words were simple, yet the way he said them made Josephine's heart turn over, as if a door she had kept locked for years had shifted on its hinges. Mr. Calthorpe appeared again, polite and efficient, to escort Josephine to the sitting room where Lady Ashford would later receive her. As Josephine followed, she glanced back once. The Marquis stood in the library doorway motionless, one hand pressed lightly against the place in his coat where the letter was hidden. His face was composed again, but his eyes remained fixed on Josephine as if he were memorizing something he had not expected to want. Josephine looked away before her gaze could betray her. She walked on with measured steps, spine straight, chin lifted. But inside her, beneath the discipline she had built like a fortress, something fragile and startling stirred. Not certainty, not safety, hope. And in a house full of watchful eyes, hope felt like the most dangerous secret of all. Morning sunlight spilled softly over the fields that surrounded Ashford Hall, gilding the frost on the grass and turning the bare branches into lace. From her window, Josephine Hargreaves watched the thin mist rise from the ground, shivering as though the earth itself still remembered the cold night. The view should have been comforting, but the beauty of it pressed against her chest like a weight she could not move. Her first morning as the future Marchioness of Ashford had begun with whispers behind doors, the rustle of silk in hallways, and the subtle glances of servants who tried to appear invisible. Everything in this house breathed order and wealth. The gleam of polished floors, the symmetry of portraits, the measured rhythm of footsteps that spoke of generations accustomed to command. Josephine had grown up in smaller, warmer places, where laughter was easier and where a woman's worth was not measured by how quietly she could walk. Now she found herself in a home where silence ruled like a monarch. A soft knock drew her from her thoughts. "Enter," she said, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. Mrs. Pritchard stepped inside, carrying a breakfast tray. Her posture was stiff, her grey hair hidden beneath a crisp white cap, her expression unreadable. "My lady, the housekeeper's duty requires that I see to your comfort," she said, setting the tray down with exact precision. "I trust the room is to your satisfaction." "It's lovely," Josephine replied sincerely. "Too lovely for someone not yet a wife." Mrs. Pritchard gave a curt nod, her eyes flicking briefly to Josephine's simple gown. "Lord Ashford values propriety. He appreciates discipline above comfort." Josephine smiled faintly. "Then we are alike in one regard." The older woman hesitated, studying her. There was something cautious in her gaze, neither cruelty nor warmth, merely judgment suspended until further evidence appeared. "Breakfast will be cleared in an hour," she said finally. "Lady Ashford requests your presence in the east parlour thereafter." "Lady Ashford?" "Yes, my lady." The title sounded wrong in Mrs. Pritchard's mouth, as if it were a word she refused to believe belonged to Josephine. When she was alone again, Josephine sat at the small writing desk near the window, forcing herself to eat a few bites of bread. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. She had imagined many futures, but none where she would be a guest in a house that would soon bear her name, belonging to a man who had kissed her hand once out of courtesy, and then sealed his heart away behind manners and silence. By the time she reached the east parlour, her breath was steady again. Lady Ashford was already seated there, framed by a high window whose light made her pearls glow faintly against her dark gown. She was a woman of grace so polished that it gleamed into intimidation. Her hair, silver white, was arranged with care, her movements slow but deliberate. "Miss Hargreaves," Lady Ashford said without rising. "Please sit." Josephine curtsied and obeyed. The tea service on the low table between them was untouched, as if merely decorative. "I trust the household met your expectations," Lady Ashford continued. "They exceeded them," Josephine said. "I am very grateful." "Gratitude is a fine quality," Lady Ashford replied, her voice smooth as still water. "But in this house, usefulness will serve you better." Josephine inclined her head. "Then I hope to be useful." The older woman smiled slightly, though the smile never reached her eyes. "Lord Ashford is a man of duty. I expect you understand the nature of this arrangement." Josephine's heart thudded once, but her voice remained calm. "It was explained to me. A union of convenience," Lady Ashford said plainly. "You offer a modest dowry and a reputation of quiet manners. In return, You receive protection and a title that will secure your future. There are no illusions between us, I hope. No, my lady. Good. Lady Ashford leaned back, studying her as one might study a portrait before deciding whether to hang it in a public hall. I require a daughter-in-law who does not draw attention. Modesty and discretion are virtues in a world too fond of spectacle. Josephine's lips curved faintly. Then you may rest assured, my lady. I have never been accused of drawing admiration. The honesty in her tone startled Lady Ashford into silence. For an instant something flickered in her gaze, perhaps pity, perhaps respect, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Charm fades, Miss Hargreaves, she said softly, but composure endures. Remember that. Josephine bowed her head. I will. When she left the room, her hands were cold, her pulse too quick. She had spoken truthfully, and the truth had cost her nothing. But the air in the parlour had felt like a test she could not win. She wandered through the corridor, past heavy curtains and portraits of women whose smiles had been painted into obedience. The stillness of the house was oppressive. Every echo of her steps reminded her she was a guest in her own story. Then as she turned a corner, she almost collided with someone. A firm hand steadied her arm before she could fall. "Forgive me," said a deep, calm voice. Josephine looked up and met Robert's eyes. The Marquis of Ashford stood before her, perfectly composed in a dark navy tailcoat, his cravat immaculate, his expression unreadable. The faintest scent of cedar and ink surrounded him, clean, masculine, and controlled. "My lord," she said, stepping back. "You should be more careful," he said, though there was no true rebuke in his tone. His hand lingered a moment longer than necessary before falling away. "I was thinking," she admitted, "perhaps too much." "A dangerous habit in this household," he replied dryly. Josephine's lips parted in surprise, then curved into a small, cautious smile. "I have already discovered as much." He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide what to make of her. "My mother spoke with you?" "She did." "Gun survived the encounter," he murmured. Josephine's smile deepened despite herself. "Barely." Something like amusement flickered across his face, gone before it could settle. "You are braver than I expected." "Or more foolish," she said lightly. "I am not sure which." Their eyes met, and for the first time since their acquaintance began, the silence between them did not feel like a weapon, but like an invitation. Robert's gaze softened just slightly. "Do you find this arrangement intolerable, Miss Hargreaves?" Josephine hesitated. "I find it uncertain." He tilted his head. "That is fair. It was never meant to be romantic." She forced her voice steady. "I know." "Do you?" She blinked. "My lord?" He stepped closer, not enough to startle, but enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the quiet command in his presence. "I made this decision for reasons that are my own," he said slowly. "I owe you honesty, if nothing else. This marriage will silence speculation about my family's affairs and protect what must remain private. You were chosen because you are honorable, discreet, and because I believed you would not demand more than what was promised." Josephine swallowed hard. "And what was promised?" "Security," he said softly. "Respect. A place here, if you choose to accept it." His voice was gentle, but there was a finality to it that broke something inside her she had not realized was fragile. She looked down, forcing a breath past the ache in her throat. "I see," she whispered. He frowned. "I mean no cruelty." "No," she said quickly. "You mean duty, and perhaps that is kinder than pretending affection you do not feel." Robert said nothing. The tension between them hummed like a drawn bow. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "You misunderstand me." Her eyes lifted to his. "Then help me understand." For a long moment he seemed on the verge of speaking something he had kept locked inside, but his jaw tightened, and whatever truth hovered there retreated. "It is not a matter for this morning," he said finally. Josephine inclined her head. "Then I will not press." He stepped back, hands clasped behind him, posture once more impeccable. "You should walk in the garden. The air may ease the weight of this house." "Will you accompany me?" The question escaped her before she could stop it. It surprised them both. He looked at her, searching her face as though deciding whether to trust her sincerity. Then, very quietly, he said, "For a few minutes." They walked together through the eastern door that opened onto the gardens. Frost still clung to the hedges, and the fountain at the center gleamed like glass. The silence was companionable at first, filled with the crisp rhythm of their steps on the gravel path. "Did you always live here?" Josephine asked. "Since I was a boy." "Then you must know every stone by heart." "Too well," he said. "There is comfort in familiarity and imprisonment too." She looked at him sideways. "And which do you feel now?" He smiled without warmth. "That depends on who is asking." "The woman who will soon bear your name," she replied softly. Robert stopped walking. The breeze caught the edge of his coat, lifting it slightly. "You speak boldly, Miss Hargreaves." "I speak honestly." Their gazes locked again, and the air seemed to narrow between them. He took a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "Honesty is a rare gift in this world. Guard it carefully. Some will try to take it from you." "I have already seen that," she said. He looked at her then, not at her face, not at the symmetry she lacked, but at her eyes. Something in them seemed to hold him still. "You do not look away," he murmured, "even when you are afraid." "I have spent too many years looking away from things that hurt," she answered. "It never saved me." The faintest flicker of admiration passed through his gaze. "Perhaps you will survive Bibury better than most." "Survive?" she echoed. "You speak as if it were a battle." "It can be," he said quietly. "People in small places find pleasure in cruelty." "Then perhaps we are not so different, my lord." He turned toward her, one eyebrow lifting. "In what way?" "Both of us know what it is to be observed," she said, "to have every word weighed, every silence misread." He was silent for a moment. "Perhaps we are not different at all," he admitted. A robin landed near the fountain, shaking its feathers against the frost. The sound broke the stillness. Josephine exhaled slowly, realizing her hands had curled into fists inside her gloves. Robert noticed. Without speaking, he reached out and adjusted her shawl where the wind had loosened it. His fingers brushed her shoulder, lightly, briefly, but the contact felt like lightning through her veins. "Thank you," she murmured. He met her eyes again, and for one unguarded heartbeat, there was something raw there, a tenderness he could not disguise. Then he straightened, withdrawing his hand. "You should return indoors. My mother will expect you to call upon the dressmaker this afternoon." Josephine nodded, her voice softer than she intended. "Yes, my lord." He turned to go, but before he took 2 steps, he hesitated. "Josephine!" Her name on his tongue startled her. It sounded different when spoken with care. "Yes?" His gaze lingered on her face. "You are not what they say." The words were simple, but they struck deeper than he could have known. Her breath caught. "And what do they say?" "That you are plain," he said quietly. "That you are unremarkable." She waited, her pulse trembling between fear and hope. He took a slow step closer. "They are wrong." Josephine felt her throat close around the rush of emotion that rose there. She wanted to thank him, to speak, to say something worthy of the moment, but the words would not come, so she only nodded. When he left her in the garden, the echo of his voice remained, wrapped around her like the warmth of the sun she had not realized she'd been missing. Inside Ashford Hall, the air seemed lighter than it had that morning. Josephine crossed the marble floor, the faint scent of roses from the hallway vases following her. Her reflection in the glass door looked unchanged, same pale skin, same tired eyes. But inside her, something quiet and steady began to bloom. It was not love, not yet, but it was hope, and that was dangerous enough. The day of the assembly dawned with a sky as pale as porcelain, the kind of winter morning when even the sun seemed reluctant to wake. Bibury hummed with quiet expectation. For weeks, the townspeople had spoken of nothing but the ball to be held at the hall of Mr. and Mrs. Linton, the wealthiest family in the region. It was not a grand London affair, but in the countryside, Such gatherings meant everything. The chance to gossip, to compare fortunes, to measure futures, and tonight they would measure hers. Josephine stood before the mirror in her chamber, the candlelight flickering over her reflection. The gown chosen by Lady Ashford's modiste had arrived that afternoon, a soft ivory silk with a high empire waist, its short sleeves trimmed with pale gold ribbon. The simplicity was deliberate. Lady Ashford had declared that excessive ornament would invite mockery. Yet the gown's restraint suited Josephine. It reminded her of who she had always been, not meant to dazzle, but to endure. Mrs. Pritchard entered with quiet steps, carrying a shawl of dove-grey wool. "The carriage will be ready in half an hour, my lady," she said, her tone cautious, as if afraid her presence might disturb Josephine's fragile calm. "Thank you," Josephine murmured. The housekeeper hesitated at the door. "Forgive me, but the people of this village, they can be unkind." Josephine met her eyes in the mirror. "Then I must give them something else to speak of." When Mrs. Pritchard left, Josephine exhaled slowly and touched the small pearl pin she had placed in her hair. It had belonged to her mother, the only piece of jewelry she still possessed. She fastened it at the side of her bun, hidden enough that only she would know it was there. Outside, the horses snorted clouds of steam as Robert entered the carriage first. Immaculate in a dark blue coat and cream waistcoat, his presence carried a quiet gravity. He seemed to draw the space around him into obedience. When Josephine stepped outside, the air bit her cheeks, and her breath clouded the air like a veil. He extended his hand. "You'll need steadiness on these steps." She hesitated only a second before placing her gloved hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, firm. But there was something gentler in the way his thumb rested briefly over hers. She climbed into the carriage, the scent of cedar and starch filling the enclosed air. Neither spoke at first. The wheels began to turn, the road crunching beneath them. The silence between them had changed since their walk in the garden. It was no longer empty, but waiting. "You are quiet this evening," Robert said finally. "I am preparing myself," she replied. "For battle?" Josephine allowed a faint smile. "You said once that Bibury can be cruel. I would rather arrive armed." His gaze softened, though his voice remained even. "I do not wish you to face cruelty tonight. And yet I must." "You have me," he said simply. Josephine looked at him then, startled by the weight of those words. The candle fixed to the carriage wall threw his face half in shadow, half in gold. For the briefest moment, she allowed herself to believe him, to believe that he would stand beside her if the world turned sharp again. The Linton estate glowed like a jewel in the dark countryside. Lanterns lined the gravel drive, casting warm halos against the snow-dusted hedges. Through the tall windows, Josephine could see chandeliers glittering, music swelling. Laughter floated into the cold night as they stepped down. A hush rippled through the entrance hall when they appeared. Conversation paused just long enough for Josephine to feel the weight of every gaze upon her, the curious, the pitying, the cruelly amused. Then the murmur resumed, softer, faster. Lady Ashford's warning echoed in her memory. Composure endures. She lifted her chin and followed Robert into the ballroom. The air shimmered with perfume and candlelight. Women in gowns of rose and sapphire fluttered like birds, their laughter high and sweet. Men clustered in corners, their polished boots glinting on the marble floor. Mrs. Linton, round and radiant in emerald satin, greeted them with effusive politeness. "Lord Ashford, how delightful to see you among us again! And your charming fiancé? What an honour!" Josephine curtsied. "You are very kind, Mrs. Linton." Mrs. Linton's smile did not falter, but her eyes flicked to Josephine's gown with faint surprise, as if expecting a spectacle and finding restraint instead. "Simplicity," she said, approving but distant. "So very refined." Robert's expression gave nothing away. "My fiancé prefers grace to glitter," he said calmly, his tone a quiet shield. Mrs. Linton's smile froze for half a heartbeat before she turned to greet another guest. Josephine felt a flicker of gratitude. It was not a declaration of affection, but it was defense, and that to her was everything. They moved through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings. Josephine endured the careful stares of women who seemed to weigh her value in silence. She saw Celia Harcourt near the musician's dais, resplendent in coral silk and too many pearls, her laughter tinkling like glass. When Celia's gaze found hers, the smile that followed was honeyed and cruel. "Oh, Miss Hargreaves," Celia said as she approached, her voice carrying the false sweetness that every woman recognizes as danger. "How wonderful to see you tonight. Your gown is so serene. One can tell you are not concerned with fashion." Josephine smiled, gentle and unflinching. "Fashion fades quickly in winter. Dignity keeps longer." A faint murmur spread through those nearby. Celia's painted smile trembled. "Of course," she said lightly. "How fortunate you are to have found a Marquis who appreciates modest virtues." Robert's presence beside Josephine shifted subtly. His voice, when it came, was low but firm. "Miss Harcourt, I appreciate many virtues in my fiancé, modesty among them." Celia's fan stilled mid-wave. Her colour rose, but she recovered quickly, curtsying with forced grace. "Then you are both truly blessed." When she retreated, Josephine's breath escaped in a quiet sigh. "You didn't have to." "I did," Robert interrupted softly. "I am not deaf to mockery." Their eyes met, and for one suspended moment, the world around them dissolved into candlelight and music. The orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz. Couples began to move to the center of the floor, skirts brushing, laughter rising. Mrs. Linton's voice rang out. "Lord Ashford, surely you will favor us with the first dance." Every head turned toward them. Josephine's pulse faltered. Robert looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You need not," she whispered quickly. "Not for me." He extended his hand. "I do nothing for you, Miss Hargreaves. I do it with you." His hand waited. She hesitated, aware of every eye, every whisper curling through the air like smoke. Then she placed her gloved fingers in his. The room seemed to inhale as he led her onto the dance floor. The musicians adjusted, the rhythm deepened, and then they were moving, slowly, carefully, perfectly in time. At first, Josephine's steps were measured by fear. She focused on the floor, on the hem of her gown brushing his polished boots. But Robert's voice reached her, soft and steady. "Breathe," he said. "I am. Not enough." She dared to lift her eyes. His were fixed on her, not critically, not even admiringly, but with quiet intent. It was the look of a man seeing something he could not explain. The room faded. The music filled the space between their words. Her hand rested in his, her other on his shoulder. The warmth of him bled through the fine fabric of her glove. When he guided her through a turn, his touch at her waist steadied her firm and sure. "You dance well," she managed. "I was taught to lead," he replied, his mouth curving slightly. "You were taught to endure. Between us, we make a passable pair." She laughed before she could stop herself, a soft, startled sound that drew a few glances from nearby dancers. He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "You should laugh more often." Josephine's breath caught. "And give them another reason to talk." "Let them," he said. "They'll talk no matter what you do." His words were not tender, but the way he said them made her chest tighten with something dangerously close to tenderness. As the dance continued, her fear loosened its hold. She moved more freely, her skirt sweeping, her heart sinking to the rhythm. Around them, the ballroom blurred into golden motion. When the final note lingered in the air, Robert did not immediately release her hand. Applause rippled through the room. The villagers' faces held surprise, confusion, reluctant admiration. Celia stood frozen by the edge of the floor, her fan trembling slightly. Robert bowed. "Miss Hargreaves." Josephine curtsied, her pulse hammering, her voice low. "My lord." When they stepped aside, he leaned closer, his tone private again. They will remember that dance. Because of you, she said. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth lifted. Because of us. Afterward, they stood near a column at the edge of the ballroom. Josephine's heart was still racing. People passed by, offering hesitant compliments, as if uncertain how to treat her now that she had survived not just the dance, but the public test of grace. She accepted each word with polite gratitude, though her thoughts spun elsewhere, to the strange warmth that had bloomed when Robert's hand found hers, to the feeling of being seen not as an ornament, but as a partner. When the music changed again, Robert's attention drifted briefly toward a group of men near the window. One of them, a tall, fair-haired stranger, watched Josephine with a gaze too direct to be polite. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Robert followed her glance. "I'm not certain. A guest of the Lintons, perhaps." The man lifted his glass in a silent, almost mocking salute before turning away. Something cold settled in Josephine's stomach. "Does he know you?" she asked. "I doubt it," Robert said, though his tone had sharpened. "But it seems he knows you." "I don't recall him." "Then let's hope it remains that way." He offered his arm again, a gesture both protective and possessive. She hesitated, then took it. Together they crossed the ballroom once more, every whisper following in their wake. As the evening drew on, Josephine excused herself to the terrace for air. The night was crisp, the sky jeweled with stars. She pressed her palms to the stone balustrade, breathing in the cold. Behind her the music softened to a distant hum. She had danced. She had not fallen. She had even laughed, and for a fleeting moment she had felt almost proud. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. Robert stood there, the light from the ballroom casting him in gold and shadow. "You shouldn't be alone out here." "I needed a moment," she said. He approached slowly. "Did they wound you?" "Not tonight." She paused. "Perhaps because you didn't let them." His voice lowered. "You needed no saving." Her eyes met his. "And yet you saved me all the same." They stood in silence, the air between them charged and tender. His hand brushed the edge of her shawl again, adjusting it over her shoulder, his touch careful but lingering. "Josephine," he said quietly, almost as if testing the sound of her name. "You surprised them all, even you, especially me." Her heart ached at the gentleness in his voice. "Then perhaps you don't know me yet." He smiled faintly. "Then I should begin to learn." For a long moment, neither moved. The moonlight silvered his hair, the frost glittered on the balustrade, and the air seemed to hold its breath. When he finally stepped back, his voice was once again composed. "The carriage will leave soon. We should not give Bibury more to discuss than we already have." Josephine nodded, though part of her wished the night could stretch just a little longer. As they re-entered the ballroom, the hum of conversation resumed, louder than before. But this time, when Josephine met the stares and whispers, she did not lower her eyes. She walked beside Robert, her head high, her pulse steady. The music followed them out into the cold night, and for the first time since she had arrived in Bibury, Josephine felt something like victory, not loud or grand, but quiet and real. It was a dance made of silence, of glances, of unsaid things, and it had changed everything. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a sky the color of pearl, pale and expectant, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Frost silvered the lawns of Ashford Hall, and every branch glittered as the light crept timidly across the fields. Inside the house, everything stirred with restrained urgency. Maids whispering down corridors, boots echoing on polished floors, the scent of beeswax and winter roses filling the air. Josephine stood before the mirror in her chamber, her reflection softened by the mist of her own nervous breath. The gown she wore was simple and pure, just as she had requested. Ivory muslin with long sleeves of delicate lace, the empire waist tied with a satin ribbon of palest gold. A small sprig of rosemary rested among the folds of her hair, a symbol of remembrance, tucked there by Mrs. Pritchard, who had said nothing as she placed it. She could hear the distant hum of activity below, the carriages arriving, the servants hurrying to their stations. The house seemed to pulse with the weight of what was to come. Yet in the stillness of her room, Josephine felt removed from it all, suspended in a fragile calm that bordered on disbelief. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her gloves. She did not fear marriage itself. She feared humiliation. The night of the assembly had shown her how quickly the village could turn laughter into cruelty, and today everyone would be watching. Every smile, every whispered breath, every flicker of disapproval would follow her from the church doors to the carriage. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said softly. Robert entered without hesitation. He was dressed in a dark tailcoat, his cravat tied with immaculate precision, his hair perfectly in place. Yet his composure could not disguise the faint tension in his eyes. He closed the door behind him, and for a moment neither spoke. "You should not be here," Josephine said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, "but I had to see you before we stand before the world." His tone was steady, but something in it, perhaps the faint roughness that crept into his last words, made her pulse quicken. "Do you come to offer courage?" she asked. He gave a small, rueful smile. "No, I think you have more than enough of that. I came to promise you something." Josephine turned fully toward him, the morning light catching on the faint sheen of her gown. "A promise?" He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel the heat of him, the scent of his cologne, faintly spiced and clean. "No matter what they say out there, you will not face it alone. If they laugh, I will silence them. If they doubt you, I will make them regret it." Her throat tightened. "Why would you do that?" His gaze lingered on her face, searching. "Because they will look at you and not see what I see." She swallowed. "And what do you see?" For a heartbeat, he said nothing. His eyes softened, the harshness in them dissolving. "A woman with more dignity than all of Bibury combined." Josephine's breath trembled out of her. She wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she whispered, "Then let us give them something to remember." He nodded once, his expression unreadable again, and left the room. The door closed with a soft click that echoed louder than she expected. When the carriage finally set out for the church, the road was lined with curious faces. Villagers paused in their morning errands to watch the procession, their breath misting in the cold air. Josephine sat upright, her gloved hands folded tightly on her lap, the world beyond the glass a blur of movement and judgment. Beside her, Lady Ashford sat rigid, her gloved fingers folded over a small prayer book. The older woman's profile was as composed as a statue. "You will walk steadily," she said without looking at Josephine. "Do not let them see you falter." "I do not intend to," Josephine answered quietly. The church stood at the heart of Bibury, its stone walls older than memory. Ivy clung to its sides, and the bell tolled with solemn rhythm. Inside, candles flickered along the pews, and the air was perfumed with pine and cold air. The guests, villagers, gentry, the curious, filled every space. As Josephine stepped from the carriage, the murmur of voices rolled like wind across a field. Her veil trembled slightly in the breeze. She could feel their eyes upon her, their pity, their skepticism, their disbelief that a woman so plain could wear a marquis's ring. Robert was waiting at the front of the church. When she saw him, something inside her steadied. He turned as she approached, and though he did not smile, his gaze held a quiet reassurance that reached her even through the veil. The ceremony unfolded like a dream. Words spoken, vows exchanged, rings gliding into place. The priest's voice was a blur, the murmured prayers a distant hum. Josephine's heartbeat was the only sound she could truly hear, pounding with every syllable of her name. When the final blessing was given, she realized her hands had stopped trembling. Outside, the winter air hit her like a breath of clarity. The churchyard was crowded now, the villagers pressing closer to watch. The bell continued to ring above them, its sound both sacred and piercing. Robert offered his arm. "Shall we?" She nodded, and they stepped out together onto the stone steps. For a moment the sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the frost. Josephine thought, perhaps foolishly, that the moment might pass without cruelty, but then a voice rose from the crowd, sharp and mocking. "Look at her!" Laughter followed, soft at first, then bolder. Another voice, high and honeyed, cut through it. "The ugliest bride in town!" The sound struck her like a slap, her vision blurred, not with tears but with the shock of it. The laughter spread, rippling outward. She saw faces she recognized, neighbors, acquaintances, smiling with that peculiar satisfaction cruelty always brings. Her body went rigid. The air seemed to vanish from her lungs. For an instant, she could not move. Robert's hand tightened around hers. He turned, his expression darkening, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until the laughter faltered. Then, without a word, he faced her again. "Josephine," he said quietly, but firmly, "look at me." She did. And before she could comprehend what he meant to do, he leaned forward and kissed her. The world fell away. The laughter ceased. The only sound was the faint rustle of her veil as his lips touched hers, firm, deliberate, without haste or hesitation. It was not a polite gesture, nor the cold courtesy of a man protecting appearances. It was a statement, a defiance, a vow made not in words, but in fire. Josephine froze, then felt her heart stumble in her chest. The cold wind swept around them, carrying gasps from the crowd, but all she could feel was the steady press of his hand at her back, the warmth of his breath as he drew away. Silence. Even the bell seemed to hold its breath. Robert turned to face the crowd, his arms still around Josephine. "My wife," he said clearly, his voice carrying with the authority of a man who had never needed to shout to be obeyed. "And I will not hear another word against her." No one spoke. The villagers looked down, murmuring, shifting uneasily. Celia Harcourt stood near the front, her fan trembling in her hand, her smile stiff and pale. Robert's expression did not soften. He guided Josephine down the steps, his hand steady at her waist. The path to the carriage seemed endless, the silence pressing on all sides. But Josephine no longer heard whispers. She heard only the echo of his voice. Inside the carriage, the door closed, shutting out the stairs. The horses started forward. Josephine sat motionless, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart was still racing, her lips still tingling with the memory of his kiss. Robert sat beside her, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. The silence between them was charged, almost unbearable. At last she spoke. "You shouldn't have done that." He turned his head slowly. "Shouldn't I?" "It will cause talk," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "They'll think you meant to—" "I meant exactly what I did," he interrupted softly. "To end their cruelty." Her throat ached. "You didn't have to humiliate yourself for me." His gaze darkened. "Humiliate?" He leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. "Josephine, I have never done anything less humiliating in my life." She blinked, startled. He exhaled, looking away, as if the confession had cost him something. "You think I kissed you to silence them. I kissed you because watching them try to destroy you made me furious." She felt her breath catch. "Furious?" "Yes." His tone softened, losing its edge. "Because they are blind. Because they don't see the strength I see when you stand there and refuse to bow your head. Because I will not let them define you." Josephine could not speak. Her heart was too full, her mind spinning with disbelief, confusion, warmth, fear, all tangled together until she could not tell one from another. Finally, she whispered, "You risked your reputation." He gave a faint, weary smile. "Then perhaps it's time I used my reputation for something worthwhile." The carriage jolted as it turned onto the road back to Ashford Hall. Josephine looked out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The sunlight had grown brighter now, spilling over the frost like gold. Her voice trembled when she said, You silenced them, Robert. He looked at her then, truly looked, and something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of understanding, of recognition, as if the distance that had existed between them had thinned just enough for the first real connection to form. Not for long, he said quietly. They'll find new words. They always do. Then let them talk, she murmured, turning her gaze back to the light. They can't take what happened on those steps. He said nothing more, but his hand found hers again, resting there, unmoving until they reached the gates of the hall. When the carriage stopped, Josephine hesitated before stepping down. She turned toward him. "Thank you," she said simply. He inclined his head. "For what?" "For choosing to stand beside me." His eyes softened, and for the first time he smiled, not the polite, distant curve she had seen before, but something real, quiet, and warm. "I told you, Josephine." "You don't face them alone," she nodded, stepping out into the cold air. The sound of the bell still echoed faintly across the fields, and the sun hung low in the winter sky, catching on the frost like the afterglow of something holy. Inside her heart, the memory of his kiss burned steady and sure, a promise written not in ink or vows, but in courage. And though she would never admit it aloud, Josephine knew that from this day forward, nothing in Bibury would ever be the same again. The winter wind moved restlessly through the trees around Ashford Hall, pressing cold breath against the tall windows, as if the world outside were testing the warmth within. Inside, the house had never seemed so large or so watchful. Servants moved like quiet ghosts, their steps muffled on polished floors. The rustle of silk and the faint clink of silver filled the corridors with a hum of expectation. It was Josephine's first morning as the new Marchioness of Ashford, and she felt as though the walls themselves were studying her. The events of the wedding still echoed in her mind like a dream that would not dissolve. The church steps, the shock of the crowd, the kiss that silenced them all, every moment returned with such vividness that she sometimes doubted it had truly happened. Her lips still remembered the warmth of Robert's, the weight of his gaze as he stood before them all, unflinching. But the world did not remember tenderness. It remembered scandal. When Josephine entered the breakfast room, conversation fell to a hush. Lady Ashford sat at the head of the table, immaculate as always, her silver hair arranged in perfect symmetry, a thin veil of civility disguising the sharpness of her scrutiny. The steward, Mr. Calthorpe, stood near the door with a ledger, and two maids hovered by the sideboard, pretending to busy themselves with tea service, while their eyes flicked curiously toward the new mistress of the house. "Good morning, Lady Ashford," Josephine said, her voice even. Her mother-in-law's eyes rose briefly from her cup. "Marchioness." The single word was acknowledgement and test all at once. "I trust you rested." "I did, thank you." Lady Ashford gestured toward the chair opposite her. "Join me. We dine together on the first morning of every marriage in this family. Tradition must be observed, even when circumstances are unconventional." Josephine sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Of course." A long pause settled between them, filled only by the faint clatter of the maids pouring tea. Finally, Lady Ashford spoke again, her tone measured. "Your appearance in the church yesterday caused considerable discussion." Josephine's heart tightened, but she kept her face composed. "I am aware. I do not approve of public displays," Lady Ashford continued, "but I must admit, your husband's decision spared us further disgrace." Josephine met her gaze calmly. "Then we should both be grateful to him." The older woman studied her with cool fascination. "Indeed, but gratitude, my dear, is not the same as belonging. Bibury has a long memory. You must tread carefully if you wish to survive its judgment." "Survival," Josephine said softly, "has always been my specialty." A faint spark appeared in Lady Ashford's eyes, something between respect and resentment. She lifted her teacup, concealing the smallest of smiles behind the rim. When breakfast ended, Josephine excused herself and wandered through the house. The corridors seemed endless, lined with portraits of solemn ancestors. The eyes of those long-dead Ashfords followed her wherever she walked. Men in powdered wigs, women in pearls, their painted gazes heavy with disapproval. She paused before one portrait in particular, a young woman with chestnut hair and a serene smile. Beneath the frame was a brass plaque, Eliza Ashford, 1775-1799. There was a softness in her expression that the others lacked. Josephine lingered there, studying the painting, until she felt the presence of someone behind her. "You favor her," Robert's voice said quietly. She turned, startled, though his footsteps had made no sound on the carpet. "I do? In grace, not likeness," he said. He stood close, hands clasped behind his back, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his face unreadable. "She was my aunt, died before I was born. They said she had a gentle heart." Josephine tilted her head, glancing again at the portrait. "Then perhaps she would not have disapproved of me." A shadow crossed his features. "She would have liked you." There was warmth in his tone, and it caught Josephine off guard. "That sounds like affection, my lord." "Oh, observation," he corrected softly, though a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. The faint tension that always lived between them began to soften. They walked together through the long gallery, their footsteps echoing in rhythm. "Will you always call me my lord?" he asked suddenly. Josephine blinked. "Would you prefer something else?" "I would prefer honesty." She hesitated. "Then I will call you Robert, when propriety allows it." His gaze met hers. "And in private." Her voice was barely a whisper, "perhaps even when it does not." For a moment something unspoken passed between them, a spark too intimate for daylight. But before it could become something more, footsteps sounded from the corridor behind them. A maid hurried past, carrying a stack of linens, her eyes darting toward them before dropping instantly to the floor. The spell broke. Robert's voice returned to formality. "You should not wander alone. The staff will gossip enough as it is." "I'm accustomed to gossip," Josephine replied, though her cheeks still burned faintly. "It rarely kills." He looked at her with something like admiration. "No, but it wounds." Their conversation ended there, but the warmth of it lingered long after Robert disappeared down the corridor. That afternoon, Josephine walked through the gardens to escape the stillness of the house. The winter sun was pale, but it lit the frost on the hedges until they glittered like spun glass. She pulled her shawl tighter, the cold biting at her skin. As she neared the gate that opened to the village road, a voice stopped her. "Marchioness." Josephine turned. It was Celia Harcourt. She stood just beyond the fence, her coral cloak bright against the grey sky, her face flushed with false warmth. "Miss Harcourt," Josephine said, her tone polite but cool. "I came to offer my congratulations," Celia said sweetly, stepping closer. "Bibury has never seen such a spectacle, a Marquis defending his bride with a kiss before the entire town. You must be proud." Josephine's heart tightened. "I am grateful for my husband's kindness." "Kindness," Celia repeated, letting the word linger like perfume. "Is that what you call it? Some say it was pity. Others think it was desperation." Josephine's jaw stiffened, but her voice remained calm. "And what do you think, Miss Harcourt?" Celia smiled, her teeth too white against her painted lips. "I think men tire quickly of noble gestures." The wind lifted the edge of Josephine's veil, brushing her cheek like a warning. "Then I hope you find a man strong enough not to." Celia's expression flickered just for an instant before she recovered. "We shall see which of us he remembers when the fire of charity fades." She turned, her cloak sweeping the frosted grass, and disappeared down the road. Josephine stood still long after she was gone, the words echoing in her mind. That evening at supper, she found the courage to speak. The dining room was grand but cold, the candlelight soft against polished silver. Robert sat at the head of the table, his mother at his right. Conversation was scarce. The clinking of cutlery filled the silence like falling glass. When the servants withdrew, Josephine said quietly, "I met Miss Harcourt today." Robert's knife stilled. "Did you?" "She came to congratulate me." Lady Ashford's voice cut through the air like the crack of frost. "That woman's presence on our property is improper." "I did not invite her," Josephine said. "She invited herself." Robert's gaze darkened. "What did she want?" "To remind me that gossip has a longer life than truth." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You handled her?" "I did." A faint smile curved his lips. "I never doubted it." Their eyes met, and something quiet and dangerous passed between them, a kind of mutual understanding that felt almost like unity. When dinner ended, Lady Ashford excused herself early, leaving them alone. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its light flickering over the carved wood panels. Robert poured a glass of wine and approached her. "You do not flinch easily," he said. "I learned long ago that fear gives others power." He handed her the glass. "And yet you came here knowing what they would say." Josephine took the wine, her fingers brushing his. "I came here because I chose to." He studied her for a moment, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You surprise me, Josephine." "Because I refuse to tremble. Because you make me remember what decency looks like." The words landed between them with the weight of confession. Josephine felt the heat rise to her face. "You give me more credit than I deserve." He shook his head slightly. "Not enough." The silence that followed was not empty, but charged, pulsing with everything neither dared to say. She could hear the fire crackle, the whisper of his breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "If they speak of you, let them. I have chosen my side." Her heart caught. "And if your side becomes mine?" He smiled faintly, lowering his gaze. "Then perhaps we will both find peace in defiance." The moment stretched, tender, fragile. She could feel the tension between them like a thread drawn too tight. Every small gesture became an intimacy. The turn of his hand as he set down the glass, the faint tilt of his head as he looked at her, the soft fall of his breath in the firelight. Then suddenly the fragile peace broke. A servant entered, pale-faced, holding a folded note. "Forgive me, my lord, but this was found at the front gate." Robert took the paper, frowning. He opened it, and his expression hardened. "Who delivered this?" "No one saw, my lord." He handed the note to Josephine. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink blotched by the damp. It contained only one sentence. "She does not belong to you." "I know what her father did." Josephine's blood ran cold. The fire seemed to dim around her. Robert's voice was quiet but taut. "Do you recognize it?" "No," she whispered. "But whoever wrote it wishes to wound me." He folded the note slowly, his jaw tightening. "Then they will answer for it." Josephine looked up at him, her heart hammering. "Do not trouble yourself. It is only words." "Words," he said darkly, "have destroyed empires." She reached out before she could think, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "Please, let it go for tonight." His gaze fell to where her hand rested on his arm. For a moment, his anger melted into something else. Protectiveness, maybe even tenderness. "Very well," he said quietly. "Tonight." He placed the note in his coat pocket, as if by hiding it he could shield her from its poison. Then he turned back to her, his expression softening. "Josephine, whatever your father was or was not, it has no bearing on you." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let his words sink into the cracks of her fear and seal them closed. "Thank you," she murmured. Robert stepped closer, his voice barely a breath. "They will not touch you while I draw breath." The promise hung in the air, fierce and beautiful. When Josephine retired to her chamber later that night, she stood by the window long after the candles had burned low. The fields stretched silver beneath the moon, the hall behind her vast and silent. Somewhere beyond those walls, someone was watching, waiting. But within her, a new kind of strength was stirring. The quiet certainty that she was no longer alone in the battle to be seen, to be believed, to be loved. And though she could not yet name what was growing between her and Robert, she felt it like a heartbeat in the dark, steady, defiant, and impossibly alive. The morning broke grey and heavy, a veil of mist settling over the fields like an omen. Ashford Hall stood solemn and proud against the pale horizon, its windows catching the weak light of dawn. Within its walls, silence reigned, thick, anticipatory, as though the house itself knew that something hidden was about to surface. Josephine awoke with a start, her pulse unsteady, the memory of the threatening note from the night before still echoing in her thoughts. The ink of those words, "I know what her father did," had burned into her mind, stealing her rest and her peace. She rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and stood by the window. Outside, the world seemed untouched by malice, the distant hills, the smoke from the chimneys, the frost clinging to the hedges. Yet beneath that beauty lay a truth she could no longer ignore. Someone in Bibury knew something and intended to use it against her. When she descended to the breakfast room, she found it empty. Only the remains of Robert's meal lay upon the table. Half-drunk coffee, a folded newspaper, and a leather glove left carelessly near the silver tray. A servant informed her that the Marquis had gone to his study early, asking not to be disturbed. "Did he seem upset?" she asked quietly. The servant hesitated. "Not upset, my lady. Determined." Determined. The word struck her like a small, cold stone. Josephine nodded her thanks and dismissed the servant, her mind turning over the possibilities. She had seen that look in Robert before, controlled anger, buried beneath composure. If he had spent the night thinking of the note, he might already be seeking the culprit, and that frightened her more than the threat itself. Later, when the house had quieted and Lady Ashford had retired to her morning prayers, Josephine made her way down the long west corridor that led to the study. The corridor was dim, the air faintly scented with polish and old parchment. Her soft steps were muffled by the thick carpet, and the faint murmur of the wind outside followed her like a whisper. At the door, she paused. The latch was unfastened. She pushed it open slightly, peering in. The room beyond was bathed in muted light. Robert's desk stood near the tall window, its surface covered with open books and scattered papers. A fire burned low in the grate, sending ribbons of smoke into the air. He was not there. Something drew her inside, the quiet hum of mystery, the pull of something she did not yet understand. She stepped across the threshold, her pulse quickening. The study was lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes, their spines gilded and worn. Maps and letters were pinned to one wall, evidence of a man who valued order but lived surrounded by secrets. On the desk lay a small stack of correspondence, one envelope bearing her father's familiar handwriting. Josephine froze. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. She reached out, trembling, and brushed her fingertips against the paper. Her name was not written there, but the looping script was unmistakable, elegant and firm, the same she had seen on her father's letters years ago. Before she could stop herself, she unfolded it. The ink had faded with time, the words faint but legible. "You asked for my silence, my lord. I give it, but not without cost. What was done cannot be undone, though you may bury it beneath your name. God forgive us both." The letter slipped from Josephine's hand and fluttered onto the carpet. "Josephine!" Robert's voice filled the doorway like a storm. She turned sharply. He stood there, his coat unbuttoned, his expression unreadable. The sight of the letter on the floor shifted his composure from surprise to fury in a single breath. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it was a dangerous tension. "I saw the door open," she began, her words faltering. You thought you would search my private papers." He crossed the room, his boots striking the floor with restrained force. Josephine bent to retrieve the letter, her hands shaking. "I did not mean to pry. Only what?" he demanded. "Only to remind me that trust is a luxury I cannot afford?" Her eyes filled with hurt. "You speak as though I have wronged you. You had no right to read that letter, and you had no right to hide it." Her voice rose, trembling with something fierce and desperate. "It concerns my father, does it not? Tell me the truth, Robert. Why do you have his words locked away in your study?" The question cut through the silence like a blade. Robert looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because your father's actions nearly destroyed everything my family built." The words struck her harder than any shout could have. She felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Destroyed?" she repeated faintly. "What are you saying?" He exhaled, turning toward the window. The light cast long shadows across his face, softening nothing. "Years ago, when my father still lived, there was an accusation, a financial betrayal, one that could have ruined the Ashford name. Documents went missing, money unaccounted for. It was said that your father knew of it, that he was involved." "That's impossible," Josephine said, her voice breaking. "My father was an honest man." "I believed that too," Robert said quietly, "until I found that letter." She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "What was done cannot be undone," she whispered, repeating the words. "That is not the voice of a guilty man. It is the voice of someone forced into silence." Robert's eyes lifted to hers. For a moment all his anger fell away, replaced by something like anguish. "I wanted to believe that," he said, "but my father died before I could learn the truth. That letter was the only thing he left me regarding the matter. I've kept it hidden ever since, because I cannot bear to know which of them, your father or mine, lied." Josephine's throat ached. "You kept it hidden from me because you feared I would remind you of the answer." He did not deny it. The silence between them deepened. The fire popped in the grate, throwing sparks that glowed briefly before fading. Finally Josephine spoke, her voice trembling. "If you believe my father guilty, why marry me at all?" His expression tightened. "Because I needed the truth, and because I thought I could protect you while I searched for it." "Protect me," she echoed bitterly, "by binding me to a man who doubts me every time I breathe?" His voice dropped, rough with emotion. "I doubted fate, Josephine, not you." She turned away, tears stinging her eyes. "And yet you kept this secret as if it were poison." He moved closer, the air between them charged and tense. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of what it would mean if you were innocent, and my family was not." The honesty in his voice stopped her. She turned back, and their gazes met in the dim light. Something raw and human flickered in his eyes. Shame, regret, longing. She took a step forward. "You could have told me. You could have trusted me." He shook his head slightly. "You have no idea how much I wanted to." "Then why didn't you?" He hesitated, his voice almost a whisper. "Because I was beginning to care for you, and I didn't want that to be built on lies." The confession stole her breath. The word care hung between them like a fragile flame, flickering and dangerous. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The pain, the tenderness in his expression drew her closer, despite every warning in her mind. "Robert," she began, but her voice faltered. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek without touching it. "You deserve honesty now, even if it costs me." His gaze drifted to the letter in her hand. "If your father was forced into silence, then someone else holds the key to what truly happened. I will find it, I swear." Her chest tightened with emotion. "And if the truth condemns my family, then we will face it together." The words were so quiet she almost doubted she'd heard them. Josephine's tears broke free, warm against her chilled skin. She didn't know if they were born of relief or heartbreak. All she knew was that for the first time since their marriage began, she believed him, not as a Marquis, not as a man of duty, but as someone who had chosen to stand beside her even as the world whispered against them. Without thinking, she stepped forward and rested her hand against his chest. His heartbeat thrummed beneath her palm, steady, real. "Thank you," she murmured. Robert covered her hand with his own, his touch firm and protective. "No, Josephine, it is I who should thank you. You have endured more than I deserve." She looked up at him then, her tears catching the light. "You once said you would not let them humiliate me, But sometimes it is not others who wound us most. It is silence. He closed his eyes briefly, as if the truth of her words burned. Then I will not be silent again. For a long, suspended moment, they stood there, the firelight painting their faces in shades of gold and shadow. The distance between them was no longer filled with pride or fear, but with the quiet, trembling awareness of two souls that had begun, despite everything, to reach for each other. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice low. "This letter, it changes everything, but it also means you are not alone in this." "I never asked to be saved," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "You never needed saving. You only needed someone to stand with you." The simplicity of it undid her. She wanted to look away, to gather her strength again, but his gaze held her fast. There was no arrogance in his expression now, only sincerity, a man stripped of every defense. "Robert," she said softly, "whatever lies buried between our fathers, I believe there is a truth stronger than their sins." His eyes softened. "And what is that?" "Forgiveness," she said. "It begins here." He reached for her hand again, and this time, when his fingers brushed hers, there was no hesitation. The gesture was gentle but full of promise, a silent vow that whatever storm awaited them beyond those walls, they would face it not as enemies, but as something far more dangerous. Two hearts learning at last to trust. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows. The mist thickened around the house, hiding the world from view. But within the study, where old secrets had finally begun to speak, a fragile light glowed between them. Small, unsteady, but impossibly real. Snow fell quietly over Bibury, softening the world into silence. The village roofs, the hedgerows, even the church steeple seemed wrapped in stillness, as if winter itself had decided to listen. At Ashford Hall the same calm did not exist. Beneath its grand facade, beneath its marble halls and flickering lamps, hearts and secrets were awakening, dangerous, human, and tender all at once. Josephine stood near the window of her bedchamber, gazing out at the falling snow. Her reflection stared back at her, pale skin, tired eyes, and a heart that no longer belonged entirely to herself. The night before still lingered in her thoughts. Robert's voice, low and honest, his confession that he feared what the truth might reveal, and the promise that followed, that he would not stand against her, but beside her. It had changed something inside her, something quiet, but irrevocable. The house had grown colder these days, though not because of the season. Since the letter's discovery, the air had shifted. Servants whispered, Lady Ashford watched her more closely, and somewhere beneath it all, a sense of danger pulsed like a second heartbeat. Josephine could feel it in the corners of the house, in the pause before footsteps, in the silence after doors closed. Someone still wanted her unsettled. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Pritchard entered, her face lined with concern. "My lady, his lordship asks for you in the library." Josephine turned, startled. "Now?" "Yes. He said it was urgent." She took a steadying breath, pulling her shawl closer before following the housekeeper down the corridor. The lamps cast golden pools of light along the dark hallway, the air faintly scented with smoke and pine. When she reached the library, the door was open, the fire blazing. Robert stood by the hearth, a letter in his hand, his expression grim. He turned as she entered. "Thank you for coming." "You said it was urgent," she replied softly. "It is." He handed her the letter. "This arrived an hour ago, delivered by a boy who claimed not to know its sender." Josephine unfolded the paper. The handwriting was the same as before, angular, deliberate. "You seek the truth in ashes, but what you lost lies beneath your own roof." Her pulse quickened. "What does it mean?" Robert's gaze darkened. "It means whoever is behind this knows far too much, and they are closer than I thought." She met his eyes, fear flickering through her. "Do you believe it?" "I believe we are being watched," he said simply. Josephine moved closer to the fire, staring at the letter as if its ink might reveal more under the light. They want to divide us, she murmured, to make us doubt each other again. Then they will be disappointed, Robert said firmly. She looked up, her eyes softening. Will they? He stepped closer, and the shadows shifted around them. I meant what I said yesterday, Josephine. I will not doubt you again. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them was charged, not only with fear, but with something warmer, deeper, a current of emotion that neither dared name. The flames reflected in his eyes, and in that light she saw not the stern Marquis the world knew, but the man who had chosen to defy an entire village for her. Tell me, she whispered. If you could change everything, erase the past, silence the rumors, would you? He hesitated. If it would spare you pain, yes. But would it spare you? Robert's lips curved into a faint, rueful smile. Pain is not what I fear, Josephine. Losing what I've found, perhaps that is. The words made her heart tremble. She turned slightly, unable to hold his gaze for long. You speak as if I am something worth losing. He took another step toward her, his voice low. You are the only thing in this house worth keeping. Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps broke the moment. Lady Ashford appeared in the doorway, her presence slicing through the warmth like a cold wind. I trust I'm not interrupting, she said smoothly. Robert straightened. Mother. Lady Ashford's eyes flicked from her son to Josephine. I see you've been reading letters again. It seems our home has become quite the post office for secrets. Someone is trying to provoke us, Robert said. Or perhaps, Lady Ashford replied, her gaze sharp, someone has reason to fear what will be uncovered. Josephine's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. You believe I am the cause of this? I believe trouble arrived with your name, the older woman said coldly, and now it seeps through these walls like damp through stone. Enough, Robert said quietly but firmly. This ends now. Lady Ashford looked at him with the same mixture of pride and sorrow she had worn since his childhood. I only speak what others dare not. Then perhaps they should remain silent, he replied. She turned her attention back to Josephine, her expression softening slightly but not kindly. You are not the first woman to be swallowed by this house, my dear. I suggest you learn how to breathe within its walls before it decides to close around you. With that she turned and left, her skirts brushing the threshold like a whisper of final judgment. The silence that followed was heavy. Josephine exhaled slowly, her hands trembling despite her calm face. She thinks I am the rot beneath your roof, she said. Robert moved closer, his tone gentler now. Let her think what she wishes. I know the truth. But do you? She asked quietly. Do you truly know me, Robert? He looked at her for a long moment. Not yet, he said softly. But I want to. Something fragile and luminous passed between them then. A kind of intimacy that existed not in touch, but in the shared acknowledgement of loneliness. He reached out, almost without thinking, and brushed a stray curl from her face. The gesture was innocent, but the moment it happened, the world seemed to hold its breath. Josephine's eyes lifted to his. You shouldn't look at me that way, she whispered. How should I look at you? Not as if I am something rare. I'm not. He smiled faintly. You are rare precisely because you don't believe it. Her voice trembled. If only words could make it true. They can, he said, when they are spoken by someone who means them. Her heart beat so fast she feared he might hear it. The fire crackled, casting moving light across his face, softening the lines of restraint that so often defined him. She had never seen him so unguarded. But before either could speak again, a loud knock echoed through the hall. Robert turned toward the sound, his expression tightening. Moments later, a servant appeared, carrying a folded newspaper. From London, my lord. Urgent delivery. Robert took it, scanning the front page. His eyes narrowed. This is worse than I thought, he murmured. What is it? Josephine asked. He handed her the paper. There, in bold ink, was a small column buried among reports of Parliament debates. Rumours surround Ashford Estate. Questions of inheritance and betrayal re-emerge. Josephine's stomach dropped. They printed it? Yes, he said bitterly. Someone wanted it public. She looked up at him, her voice shaking. This will destroy us. No, Robert said, his tone hardening. It will not. I will not allow it. How can you fight words once they are written? By writing my own, he replied. His determination both frightened and moved her. You would risk your name, your title, everything? He met her gaze, unflinching. For you, yes. The simplicity of it undid her. Robert. He stepped closer again, the intensity of his presence making it hard for her to breathe. I made a vow before God to protect you, not because of duty, but because I chose you. Do you understand? Tears glimmered in her eyes. I do now. He reached for her hand. Then trust me once more. Let them speak. Let them write. Let them tear down what they will. We will build something stronger in its place. Her fingers tightened around his. Together? He smiled faintly. Always together. For a moment all the tension melted away. They stood before the fire, hand in hand, the sound of the snow whispering against the window panes like a song only they could hear. Later, when Robert left to send letters of his own, Josephine remained in the library. The newspaper lay folded on the desk, the ink still sharp. She stared at it until the words blurred. Then she looked toward the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, pure and relentless, covering the tracks of those who had come before, hiding sins, perhaps forgiving them. She pressed her palm to the glass, her reflection faint against the white world beyond. For the first time, she felt that Ashford Hall, so cold, so vast, might one day become home. Upstairs, she could hear footsteps pacing in the corridor, Robert's, steady and deliberate. There was comfort in that sound. He was still there. And though the shadows of their father's secrets loomed large, another truth had begun to take root, that love, when born in the frost, burns with a fire that does not easily die. As the last light faded from the sky, Josephine whispered into the silence, "Let them come. I am not afraid." The wind answered softly, carrying her words into the snow. Words of a woman who, at last, had learned that love's courage is not loud, but unbreakable. The storm came without warning. By dusk, clouds had gathered over Bibury like an army, their edges bruised and heavy, pressing down upon the village until even the church bells seemed muted beneath their weight. Inside Ashford Hall, lamps flickered, the wind howled through the eaves, and the servants moved quickly to fasten shutters and light candles. The air was thick with unease. Josephine stood in the corridor near the grand staircase, watching the storm rise through the tall windows. Every flash of lightning revealed a landscape transformed, fields swallowed by fog, branches bending like dark ribbons in the wind. Yet it was not the weather that unsettled her. It was the note she had found that morning, slipped under her door with cruel precision. Confess before he discovers what you hide. No name, no signature, just that single line. She had burned it in the fireplace, but its words lingered like smoke in her mind. What did they mean? What confession did they demand? And who watched her closely enough to leave such poison at her door? Josephine. She turned. Robert was descending the stairs, his expression grave, a folded letter in his hand. "You should stay away from the windows," he said. "This wind could break the glass." "I have seen worse storms," she replied softly. He paused beside her. "Not here." The firelight from the nearby sconces danced across his features, strong, tired and beautiful in their restraint. He had been restless since dawn, sending messengers, meeting with the steward, speaking to the magistrate about the anonymous letters that had spread like disease through Bibury. The scandal in the London paper had already stirred whispers among the local gentry. Ashford Hall had become a fortress under siege by rumour, by resentment, and perhaps by something darker. Robert extended the letter toward her. Another arrived, this one addressed to me. She hesitated before taking it. The seal was broken. Her name appeared in the first line. "The woman you protect carries her father's guilt like a wedding dowry. Look where the gold is buried, and you will find her shame. Josephine felt the ground tilt beneath her. Who would write such a thing? Someone who profits from chaos, he said quietly. Someone who wants me to doubt you again. Her throat tightened. And do you? His gaze met hers. No. The word was simple, but it struck her with the force of something sacred. She wanted to thank him, but the words refused to come. Instead, she whispered, "Then we must find who does this. I already have my suspicions." "Who?" Before he could answer, a loud crash echoed through the hall, the sound of glass shattering. They turned toward it, their hearts quickening. A servant ran in, pale and trembling. "My lord, the stables, they're on fire." Robert's eyes widened. He turned to Josephine. "Stay inside." "No," she said, stepping forward. "If the horses—" "Josephine." His voice was firm, but she saw the flicker of fear behind his control. "Please, I can't think if I'm worried for you." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Then go." He pressed her hand briefly, then vanished into the storm, his coat whipping behind him. The moment he disappeared, the hall felt colder. The servants rushed past with buckets, shouting instructions, their faces pale in the candlelight. Josephine stood at the window, the storm's fury reflected in her eyes. Through the sheets of rain, she could see the faint glow of the fire beyond the courtyard, orange against the darkness. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something. Near the back staircase, half hidden in shadow, a figure moved, a flicker of motion, a coat disappearing around the corner. "Who's there?" she called. No answer. Without thinking, she followed. The corridor was dim, the air heavy with smoke and damp. The figure was ahead of her now, moving quickly, silently. She caught a glimpse of a hand gloved in black, of a lantern swinging low, and then it was gone, swallowed by the dark near the east wing. Her breath quickened. She should turn back. She should call for help. But something stronger than fear pulled her forward. She reached the end of the hall and found the small door that led to Robert's study, slightly ajar. A faint light glowed within. "Robert," she called softly. Silence. She stepped inside. The fire still burned in the grate, but the room was empty, or so it seemed. Then she saw the papers on his desk, scattered, torn, as if someone had rifled through them in haste. Among them lay a single open drawer, its contents missing. Before she could react, the door behind her slammed shut. Josephine spun around, her heart leaping, but when she reached the door and wrenched it open, the corridor was empty. Only the echo of footsteps lingered, fading into the distance. By the time Robert returned, drenched and breathless, the fire had been contained. His hair was damp, his coat dark with rain. "The horses are safe," he said, pulling off his gloves. The stable hand saw the blaze before it spread. Josephine met him halfway across the room. "Someone was here," she said, her voice trembling. "In your study." His expression sharpened. "Who?" "I don't know. I saw a figure, dark coat, lantern, but they disappeared. Your desk was disturbed." He strode to the study, scanning the floor. "What was taken?" "I can't be sure," she said, "but the drawer near your ledger was open." Robert's jaw tightened. "That drawer held the last letters from your father, the ones I kept to study the handwriting." She froze. "Then whoever did this wanted them." He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Or wanted you to believe that." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the storm pounding against the windows. Finally, Robert turned toward her. "Josephine, whoever we are facing, they mean to hurt us both, but they underestimate what that means." She swallowed hard. "And what does it mean?" "That I would rather burn this house to the ground than let them touch you." Her breath caught. "Don't say that." "I mean it," he said fiercely. "If they wish to destroy us, they will have to face me first." The intensity of his voice left her trembling. "Robert," he softened, stepping closer. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't speak in anger." But Josephine shook her head. "Don't apologize for caring." Something in her tone broke through his restraint. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, hesitant but sure. "You should rest," he murmured. You've been through enough tonight. Ah, I can't, she whispered. Not while this house feels like a stranger's. He studied her face, his voice lowering. Then let me make it feel like home. Their eyes met. The air between them shifted, growing warm despite the storm that battered the windows. She could hear the rhythm of his breath, the faint crackle of the fire, the steady beat of her own heart. When his thumb traced the back of her hand, she did not pull away. You frighten me, she said softly. How? Because I can't decide whether I'm safer with you or because of you. He smiled faintly. Perhaps it's both. The silence that followed was fragile, filled with everything they could not yet say. The thunder rolled overhead, and she felt him step closer, his presence surrounding her like warmth against the cold. Josephine, he murmured, whatever comes, I need you to believe one thing. What is that? That I will never stop fighting for you. Her voice trembled. Even if the truth destroys us, then it will destroy us together. Her eyes filled, though she refused to let the tears fall. You shouldn't speak so carelessly of forever. Then let me prove it instead. He took her hand again, pressing it gently against his chest. His heartbeat thudded beneath her palm, strong, steady, alive. Do you feel that? He asked. She nodded, barely breathing. That is what you've done to me, he said. You've made me feel again. For the first time since her arrival at Ashford Hall, Josephine's fear began to ease, not because the danger had passed, but because she knew now that she would not face it alone. They stood there, their hands still entwined, as the storm outside raged and the lanterns in the corridor burned low. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the walls, shadows that danced like ghosts of the past, yet could no longer command their silence. When Robert finally released her hand, it was only to reach for the nearest candle and relight it. Tomorrow, he said, his voice calm again, we begin our own investigation. If this house hides the truth, we will find it. Josephine met his gaze. Together, he smiled, always together. And though the storm howled around them, the light between them refused to fade. As the last of the fire settled into embers, Josephine stood at the window once more. The wind had begun to quiet, the snow falling slower now. Somewhere deep inside the house, a door creaked, a sound ordinary in another night, but now carrying the echo of promise and danger intertwined. She closed her eyes, her hand pressed over her heart, and whispered a prayer, not for safety, but for strength. Because love, she was beginning to learn, was not born from peace. It was born from the fire that survived the frost. And that night, within the walls of Ashford Hall, that fire burned quietly, steady, defiant, and alive. The winter sun rose weakly over Bibury, its light thin and uncertain, slipping across the frost-laced fields like a hesitant promise. Inside Ashford Hall, the air carried the scent of damp stone and smoke from the fireplaces that had burned all night to hold back the cold. Yet even the fire could not melt the chill that had settled between the Marquis and his wife. It was not a coldness of resentment, but of silence, the kind that lingers when words become too heavy to speak. Josephine woke to the quiet hum of wind beyond her window and the faint echo of footsteps below. For the first time since her marriage, she found her courage faltering. Each day the tension had deepened, the mysterious letters had ceased, but the fear of what they had revealed still haunted her. She could not ignore the truth that lingered like a shadow over their fragile peace. Somewhere within these walls, the past was waiting to be unearthed. She rose and dressed slowly, her fingers trembling as she fastened the buttons of her gown. It was a deep forest green, plain but graceful, chosen without thought of fashion, only of the steadiness it gave her when she wore it. Her reflection in the mirror looked older than she remembered, composed, yes, but weary in the eyes. Love, she realized, was not soft or gentle. It was a battle of endurance, of trust fought and reforged in the dark. When she descended to the library, she found Robert already there. The light from the tall windows fell across his profile, illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He stood near the hearth, a letter in his hand, unread. He did not look up when she entered. "You didn't come to bed," she said quietly. "I had work," he replied without turning. His voice was calm, but the faint roughness in it betrayed sleeplessness. Josephine stepped closer. "And did you find anything?" He hesitated. "I found silence, the kind that feels like warning." She frowned. "Meaning?" Robert finally looked at her. His eyes, normally so steady, held something close to anguish. "Meaning that the truth may already be here, Josephine, closer than we imagined." Her breath caught. "You think someone within the house?" He nodded once. "Someone who knew your father, someone who knew mine, someone who profits from fear." Her voice trembled. "Then we must confront them." His expression softened. "You speak as if courage were effortless." "It isn't," she said. "It's only necessary." For a long moment he simply looked at her, the woman who had once been the subject of ridicule and pity, now standing before him like the only thing that still made sense in a world built on lies. He crossed the room slowly, the distance between them shrinking until he stood close enough that she could feel the faint warmth of his breath. "I've asked the steward to bring me my father's ledgers," he said. "They hold records from the year your father's letter was written. If the truth lies anywhere, it will be there." She nodded. "Then let us read them together." He smiled faintly. "You insist on fighting beside me even now?" Her answer was soft but steady. "I swore the same vow you did, Robert, for better or worse." The door creaked open. Mr. Calthorpe entered, carrying a small chest of worn leather. His expression was strained, his hands shaking as he placed it on the desk. "These are all that remain of the old Marquis's private accounts," he said. "I'd advise caution, my lord. Some truths were never meant to be found." "Thank you," Robert said, his voice tight. "Leave us." When they were alone, Josephine knelt beside the chest and unlatched the clasp. Dust rose as the lid opened, carrying with it the scent of parchment and time. Inside were ledgers, letters, and sealed receipts. She lifted one carefully, a record of payment made to Mr. Edmund Hargreaves nearly 20 years before, her father's name. Robert leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. "Your father received money from mine." Her voice was barely a whisper. "For what purpose?" He turned a few pages, scanning the neat handwriting. "It says here, compensation for loss during construction of the lower mills, the same year the accusation of embezzlement began." Josephine frowned. Then he wasn't stealing. He was owed. Robert's eyes darkened as realization struck. "The money my father paid him, someone intercepted it. The records were altered to make it appear as theft." "By whom?" He said nothing. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tightening. She could see the truth forming in his mind before he spoke it aloud. "My cousin Charles. He managed the accounts that year. He was sent away after the scandal broke, but no one questioned him. My father believed in him blindly." Josephine pressed a hand to her mouth. "Then my father was innocent?" "Yes," Robert said softly, "and mine was deceived." For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled, the storm outside groaned against the glass, and the truth hung between them, both liberating and unbearable. Then Josephine looked up, tears gathering in her eyes. "He died carrying that shame, and your father died believing in a lie." Robert knelt beside her, his voice breaking. "Then let us be the ones who end it." She turned to face him. "What will you do?" "Bring the truth to light," he said simply, "even if it stains the Ashford name." Her eyes widened. "You would risk everything?" "I already have," he said, "from the moment I chose to love you." The confession was quiet, almost accidental, but its weight filled the room. Josephine stared at him, her breath caught between disbelief and wonder. "Love?" she whispered. He met her gaze without flinching. "I told myself it was duty, that I married you to restore honor to both our families, but that was a lie, Josephine. The truth is simpler and far more dangerous. I love you." Her heart trembled. "And if this destroys us, then we will be destroyed together," he said, "but not in silence." She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his face. The roughness of his jaw met her fingertips, warm beneath her cold hands. "You said once that you feared what it would mean if I were innocent," she murmured. "What do you fear now?" He caught her hand gently, pressing it to his chest. "That you might stop loving me before I earn it." Her tears spilled then, soft and unashamed. "You have earned it, Robert, from the moment you chose to see me when no one else would." He drew her into his arms, not with haste, but with the kind of reverence one reserves for something fragile and eternal. Her cheek rested against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. They stood there for what felt like a lifetime, two souls bound not by duty or pretense, but by truth. Outside, the wind began to ease. The world, it seemed, was listening. Later, they walked together through the conservatory, where the first fragile blooms of late winter clung stubbornly to life. The glass walls were misted with condensation, the air heavy with the scent of damp soil and roses struggling to survive the frost. It was here, in this quiet sanctuary, that Josephine stopped and turned to him. "Will you tell your mother?" she asked. "Yes," Robert said. "She will not forgive easily, but she must know the truth. She will blame me." "She has blamed you for everything since the day you arrived," he said gently. "But not this time." Josephine smiled faintly. "You sound certain." "I am," he said, "because she will see what I see now, that you are the reason this house still stands." The words touched something deep within her. She looked around at the conservatory, the glass, the greenery, the fragile warmth. "When I first came here, I thought this house hated me," she said quietly. "Now I realize it was only waiting for someone to open the windows." Robert stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And you have done that, Josephine. You've let the light in." Her voice trembled. "Then let us never close it again." He smiled, and for the first time, the weight in his eyes lifted. "Agreed." They stood together in the dim light, surrounded by the gentle whisper of leaves. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving only the sound of melting ice dripping from the roof. In that stillness, the house no longer felt haunted. It felt alive. Josephine reached for one of the roses on the trellis, its petals trembling beneath her touch. "This one shouldn't have survived the frost," she said softly. "It's stubborn," Robert murmured, "like you." She laughed quietly, the sound fragile but real. "Then perhaps there's hope for us after all." He caught her hand again, bringing it to his lips. "There is more than hope," he said. "There is forgiveness." The word hung between them like a benediction. When they left the conservatory, the sky had begun to clear. The clouds parted just enough for a pale beam of sunlight to fall across the garden, turning the melting snow to gold. Josephine paused at the window, her heart full. For the first time, she did not feel like an intruder in this house, nor a burden to its legacy. She felt like its heart, and as Robert stood beside her, his hand finding hers in quiet unity, she knew that whatever waited beyond these walls, rumor, judgment, or fate, they would face it not as two wounded souls, but as one. Ashford Hall had been built upon secrets, but now it would stand upon truth. And beneath its cold stone and silver light, something stronger than pride had taken root. It was love, quiet, fierce, and everlasting. The morning arrived with a strange clarity, as if the sky had washed itself clean during the night. The storm had spent its fury, and what remained was a quiet world covered in pale light and softened snow. Ashford Hall stood steady against it all, its stone walls cold to the touch, yet within them something warmer had begun to take root. Truth, at last, and the courage to speak it aloud. Josephine was in the library when the knock came. It was not the gentle tap of a maid with tea, nor the cautious pause of a servant afraid of interrupting. This knock carried urgency. "Come in," Robert called, his voice already tense. A stable hand stepped inside, cap in hand, his cheeks red from cold and nerves. He was young, barely more than a boy, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that belongs to those who carry news too heavy for their age. "My lord," he stammered. "Begging your pardon, but we found something this morning. Down by the stables, where the fire burned hottest." Robert's posture sharpened. "Found what?" The boy swallowed. "A box. Metal. Half buried in the ash where the boards fell. It wasn't meant to be seen." Josephine felt Robert's gaze flick to her. There was no panic in it now, only fierce purpose, as if the universe had finally offered them the thread they needed to pull the whole tangle apart. "Bring it," Robert said. "Now." The boy hurried out, leaving behind a silence that trembled with anticipation. Josephine stood slowly, hands folded, trying to keep her breath even. "If this is what I think it is," Robert murmured, "then whoever tried to burn evidence failed." Josephine's voice was quiet, steady with determination. "Then we will not." Minutes later, the stable hand returned with a soot-stained metal box wrapped in burlap. The lock was warped, blackened by heat, but intact. Mr. Calthorpe followed close behind, his face pale as if he already knew the shape of what was coming. Robert took the box without ceremony and placed it on the desk. He turned it once, then twice, studying it as if it were an enemy he meant to defeat. "Leave us," he told the men. When the door closed, Robert produced a small tool and forced the damaged lock. It gave with a reluctant snap. Josephine's heart beat so loudly she feared it would drown out everything else. Inside were folded papers wrapped in oilcloth, receipts, letters, and a slim ledger whose edges were burned, but whose ink remained legible. The scent of smoke rose from it, and Josephine thought bitterly how fitting it was that truth often arrived dressed in ash. Robert lifted the ledger first, his jaw tightened as he flipped through pages, his finger moving with increasing speed, as though his mind was racing ahead of his eyes. Then he stopped. Josephine leaned in. At the top of the page, in a hand that was not Robert's, was a name written with casual arrogance. Charles Ashford. Robert's breath went tight. "So he did return to this county," he said, low and dark. "And he has been in my house without my permission." Josephine's stomach turned as memories aligned. The fair-haired stranger at the assembly, the mocking salute, the unseen figure with a lantern, the papers disturbed, the missing letters, the fire set with cruel precision. It was not random. It had never been random. Robert turned another page, and the truth opened like a wound. There were entries showing diverted funds marked under false headings, payments recorded twice, then crossed out, then rewritten, receipts signed in a shaky imitation of Edmund Hargreaves's hand. And at the bottom, a letter in the old Marquis's writing, addressed to Charles with a firmness that felt like a father's final disappointment. "Read it," Robert said, his voice rough. Josephine unfolded the letter carefully. "You are dismissed from my confidence and my accounts," it said. "You have stolen from this family and attempted to place the blame upon an honest man. If you do not return what you took and confess what you have done, I will bring you before the magistrate. You will not ruin Edmund Hargreaves to protect your vanity. You will not stain the Ashford name to enrich yourself." Josephine's breath broke on a trembling exhale. Her fingers tightened on the paper until it crinkled. "My father," she whispered. "He was innocent." Robert's face looked carved from restraint and grief. "Yes," he said, "and my father knew it. He knew, and he tried to stop it." Tears blurred Josephine's vision, but she forced herself to keep reading. Another paper fell from the box, a shorter note written in Edmund's hand, the one Josephine knew by heart, the one that had once written bedtime notes to his daughter when he returned late from work. "I have taken your money only because you insisted," Edmund wrote, "not for silence but for survival. Your cousin threatened my family. I will leave Bibury if it spares Josephine from the cruelty of men who can destroy with a rumor. I pray God reveals the truth before it kills what is good in this world." Josephine's knees nearly gave way. Robert caught her instantly, one hand at her elbow, steady and warm. "Josephine," he said softly, "look at me." She did, her eyes wet, her lips trembling. "It ends today," he said. "Not tomorrow, not when the village decides to be merciful. Today." She swallowed. How? Robert's expression hardened into something unbreakable. We bring everyone who matters into one room. We put the truth in their hands. We make silence impossible. Within the hour, Ashford Hall filled with voices, not the gentle domestic voices of routine, but the charged murmur of consequence. Mr. and Mrs. Linton arrived first, breathless with curiosity. Several members of the village gentry followed. Even the vicar came, his brows knit with concern. And then, as if called by the scent of scandal itself, Celia Harcourt appeared at the edge of the crowd, her cloak too bright, her smile too practiced. Lady Ashford entered last, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. She took one look at the box on the desk, and the papers spread like accusation across the surface, and something tightened in her eyes. "What is this?" she asked coldly. Robert stood at the head of the room, Josephine at his side. He did not offer his mother a chair. "This," he said, "is what has been rotting beneath our roof." A ripple moved through the gathered guests. Celia's fan stilled. Mrs. Linton pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes gleaming with horrified delight. Robert lifted the ledger so all could see. "These records prove that Edmund Hargreaves did not steal from my father. He was framed." Whispers broke out instantly. Josephine stood still, her hands clasped, her heart pounding, not with fear now, but with fierce, aching vindication. Lady Ashford's chin lifted. "You speak as if paper cannot be forged." Robert's gaze cut to her. "It can. That is why I asked the magistrate to attend." A man stepped forward from the corner, one Josephine recognized only vaguely. Stern face, heavy coat, eyes sharp as winter. He nodded once. "We will examine the ledger," the magistrate said. "But there is more. This box was found in ash, hidden after an act of arson. That alone suggests guilt." At the word arson, a murmur of shock rose. Celia's lips parted, then snapped shut. Her eyes darted toward the door, and then the door opened. A man entered with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Fair hair, carefully styled. A coat too fine for village roads. A smile that did not reach his eyes. Charles Ashford. Robert's entire body went still. Josephine felt the air change, as if the room itself recoiled. "Well," Charles drawled, glancing at the gathering as if it were a party thrown in his honor, "this is dramatic. Cousin, you've always had a taste for spectacle." Robert's voice was quiet, deadly. "You set fire to my stables." Charles laughed lightly. "Fire? Surely you don't accuse me of such common violence." Robert lifted a scorched scrap of cloth from the box, blackened but unmistakable. A piece of glove. The stable boy found this near the box. Black leather. "Like the glove I saw on a figure with a lantern the night of the fire." Celia flinched. Josephine's gaze snapped to her, and understanding moved through her like cold water. Celia had known. Celia had always known more than she pretended. Robert continued, his voice steady. "You stole papers from my study. You sent anonymous letters. You fed London gossip so that my name would be questioned and my marriage mocked." Charles's smile wavered, just slightly. "You have no proof." Josephine stepped forward before she could stop herself. Her voice, when it came, was clear. "You mean no proof beyond your own handwriting?" she asked softly. The room stilled. Josephine lifted one of the forged receipts from the ledger and held it up. "My father's handwriting was careful, gentle. This," she said, her eyes on Charles, "is an imitation made by someone who thinks arrogance can pass for skill." Robert turned to the magistrate. "Compare it with this." He produced another paper, one that made Charles's face tighten for the first time. A letter addressed to a London editor requesting the publication of the rumour column, signed with a name that was not Charles's but written in the same hand. The magistrate took it, eyes narrowing. "Where did you obtain this?" Robert's gaze did not leave Charles. "From the inn in Bibury. The innkeeper recognized him this morning. He left in haste and forgot what he thought no one would dare touch." Charles's composure cracked. Not fully, but enough for the room to sense blood in the water. "You had no right," he hissed. Robert's voice remained calm. No right. You speak of rights after you ruined an innocent man and tried to burn the evidence. Lady Ashford stepped forward, suddenly sharp. Charles, she said, and there was steel in her voice. Tell me you did not. Charles looked at her, and for a moment, something like desperation surfaced. Aunt, you know how it is. The family name, the inheritance. Lady Ashford's breath caught. Inheritance. Charles's eyes flashed. You think I did this for sport? I did it because your precious son was always the favored one, always the rightful heir, always the good Ashford, and I— He laughed, but it sounded brittle. I was the shadow who kept the accounts and took the blame. Robert's voice dropped, heavy with disgust. So you made my father's life a lie, and Edmund Hargreaves's death a punishment. Josephine felt the word death like a knife. She did not speak of it often, not because she had forgotten, but because grief had become a private language in her chest. Charles's gaze flicked to her, and the cruelty returned. He was weak. He couldn't withstand whispers. Robert moved so quickly the room gasped. He stepped between Charles and Josephine, not touching him, but standing close enough that his presence became a wall. You will not speak of her father again, Robert said softly. Not unless you wish to learn what real weakness looks like. Celia's fan slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. The sound was small, but in that silence it was thunder. Robert turned his head slightly. Miss Harcourt. Celia's face went pale. You carried letters for him, didn't you? Robert asked. You delivered words like daggers and pretended your hands were clean. Celia's lips trembled. I only repeated what others said. Josephine's voice was quiet, sharper than the winter air. No, you chose it. Celia's eyes filled with sudden tears, but Josephine did not soften. Tears did not undo cruelty. They only tried to decorate it. The magistrate stepped forward. Charles Ashford, you will come with me. If these documents are verified, you will answer for fraud, arson, and intimidation. Charles's face twisted. You think you can imprison me for paper? For truth, Robert corrected. Charles lunged toward the desk as if to snatch the ledger, but two men caught him at once. He struggled, snarling like an animal cornered. As he was dragged away, his gaze found Robert's, burning with hatred. You think you've won, but the village will never love her. Robert did not flinch. I didn't marry her for the village. Josephine's breath caught. Robert turned then, not to the crowd, not to his mother, but to Josephine. His eyes softened, and the entire room seemed to fall away. I married you, he said, voice steady, because you are the best thing my life has ever held. A hush swept over everyone present. Even Lady Ashford's rigid composure faltered, her fingers tightening around her gloves. Josephine's tears rose again. But this time they were not born of pain. They were born of something she had almost stopped believing in. Love, spoken without shame. After the magistrate left with Charles, the room remained tense, as if the air did not know how to settle after such upheaval. Mrs. Linton dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. The vicar murmured a quiet prayer. Guests began to withdraw in stunned silence. Lady Ashford did not move. Josephine stood with her hands clasped, her chest tight, waiting for the next wound. But when Lady Ashford finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Josephine had ever heard it. Your father, she said, looking at Josephine as if seeing her for the first time, was not the man I allowed this village to call him. Josephine's throat tightened. No, she whispered. He wasn't. Lady Ashford's eyes glimmered, not with tears, but with something like regret. I thought I protected this family by keeping suspicion pointed outward, she said. I thought I was preserving our name. Robert's voice was firm. You preserved a lie. Lady Ashford's chin trembled once. Then slowly she turned to Josephine. I owe you an apology, she said, the words stiff with unfamiliar humility. Not as a kindness, as a duty. I misjudged you. Josephine's heart thudded, but her voice remained calm. You were afraid, she replied softly. So was I. Lady Ashford's gaze fell. And yet you endured what I never could." Robert's hand found Josephine's, warm and sure. He did not speak. He simply stood with her, as he had promised. That afternoon, the village gathered near the church, drawn by rumour the way it always had been. But this time, rumour carried truth in its mouth. The vicar read a brief statement confirming Edmund Hargreaves's innocence and Charles Ashford's arrest. The words travelled over the crowd like a cleansing wind. Some faces looked ashamed, some looked stunned. Some, the cruelest, looked disappointed that their favourite story had been taken from them. Josephine stood at the edge of the churchyard, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Robert remained beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. An intimacy so restrained the world might have missed it, but she felt it like a vow. A woman approached, one of the villagers who had laughed once, loudly, thoughtlessly. Her eyes were red. Her hands shook. "Marchioness," she whispered. I'm sorry." Josephine's chest tightened. The apology did not erase the past, but it did something else. It gave the future a different shape. She nodded once. "Thank you." One by one, others followed. Not all, not enough to make the pain vanish, but enough to make the silence break. When the last of them drifted away, Josephine and Robert remained alone near the church steps, the same steps where cruelty had tried to crown her with shame. Robert turned to her, his gaze steady. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Regret what?" "Marrying into this storm." Josephine looked at the stone beneath her feet, then at him. Her eyes softened. "No," she said, "because storms reveal who stands." His breath hitched, just slightly. "And who stands with you?" She lifted her hand, touching his cheek with gloved fingers, the gesture tender and controlled, filled with everything she could not say in public. "You," she whispered. "Always you." Robert's eyes shone, and for a moment the Marquis of Ashford disappeared, leaving only a man who had been saved from his own coldness by a woman the village had dared to call unworthy. He took her hand, pressed it to his lips, then looked at her as if she were the only truth left in the world. "My wife," he said quietly, and the words sounded like triumph. Josephine's breath trembled. "Robert." He leaned closer, careful, reverent, and kissed her, not for defiance this time, not for spectacle, but for devotion. The kiss was brief, restrained, yet it held a lifetime of meaning in its gentleness. It was the kind of tenderness that does not need permission from the world. When he drew back, his forehead hovered near hers, as if he could not bear to leave her warmth. "I love you," he murmured, low enough that it belonged only to her. Josephine's eyes filled again. She smiled through her tears, her voice soft and certain. "Then let them remember that," she whispered. "Not their cruelty, not their gossip. This." Robert's hand tightened around hers, steady and sure. "They will," he said, "because from today onward, Ashford Hall will not be a house of secrets. It will be a house of truth." Josephine looked out over Bibury, the cottages, the river, the churchyard, the faces that had once been weapons and might in time become something gentler. Her heart no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like home, and as she walked away from the church with Robert beside her, the winter sun finally broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the snow, as if the world itself had chosen to bless what they had fought so hard to claim. Not perfection, not ease, but love. Quiet, fierce, and undefeated. Spring had come early to Bibury that year. The fields shimmered in soft green, the air smelled faintly of lilac, and the village bells carried across the hills with a tone that felt lighter than memory. Ashford Hall stood much the same as it always had, its stone walls unyielding, its chimneys still breathing smoke against the pale sky, but to those who knew it, everything inside had changed. It was no longer a house of silence and suspicion. It had become a home of laughter. From the upper gardens, the sound of children's voices floated through the air, bright as birdsong. A boy of 6, dark-haired and solemn-eyed, was chasing his younger sister, whose golden curls bobbed as she ran. She held a cluster of wildflowers, giggling as she fled his grasp. "Papa said you mustn't run near the fountain," he warned, though he was smiling as he said it. "And Mama said you shouldn't tell me what to do," the little girl declared, her tone a perfect echo of the woman whose courage had once silenced a whole village. From the terrace above, Josephine watched them, her hands folded around a porcelain teacup that had long gone cold. 7 years had passed since that winter of fire and confession, yet every spring still felt like a quiet miracle. Her hair, once the deep brown of polished oak, now carried threads of silver at her temples. Time had not dimmed her beauty, it had deepened it, softened it with grace and peace. The door behind her opened, and she turned before she heard the steps. She always knew the rhythm of them. Robert stood in the doorway, sunlight spilling over his shoulder. The years had touched him too, but lightly, his hair a little lighter, his expression gentler. He no longer carried the constant tension of a man guarding secrets. His gaze, when it found her, held only calm devotion. "You've been out here since dawn," he said, crossing to her. "I was listening to the bells," she replied. "They sound different now." He smiled faintly. "They do, or perhaps we do." She looked toward the garden again, where their children now sat in the grass, crowns of wildflowers upon their heads. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "how strange it is that they'll never know what this place once was?" Robert followed her gaze. "That's how it should be. They'll inherit peace, not ghosts." Josephine reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. The simple gesture had never lost its power. "Do you ever regret staying here, when we could have begun again somewhere far away?" He turned to her, eyes warm. "No, this is where we were broken, and where we healed. You rebuilt this house, Josephine, not with stone, but with love." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "You helped." He leaned closer, brushing a kiss to her temple. "I learned." Below, their children's laughter rose again. The boy had lifted his sister to pluck a blossom from the trellis, and Josephine's heart swelled at the sight. For so long she had feared the Ashford name would remain a burden. Now it was a legacy of truth. Inside the hall, life had also transformed. The servants who once moved in whispers now spoke freely. Lady Ashford, though age had made her frail, still lived in the East Wing. She no longer ruled the household with cold propriety, but with quiet observation. Age had softened her into something resembling tenderness, and when she looked upon her daughter-in-law, it was no longer with judgment, but with something almost like pride. Celia Harcourt had not been seen in Bibury since the day of the trial. Some said she had gone to London, others that she had married into a lesser fortune and lived among people who mistook cruelty for wit. None of those who remembered her cruelty missed her. Charles Ashford's fate was far less merciful. He had lived out his sentence in a debtor's prison where arrogance had no currency. He died there 5 years later, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his own ambition. The scandal that once defined the village had become, over the years, a cautionary tale. And as time went on, people began to tell a different story. The story of the Marquis, who stood by the woman everyone had mocked, and of the ugliest bride in town, who became the most beloved lady Bibury had ever known. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Josephine still found herself walking alone through the conservatory. The roses there were different now, stronger, darker in hue, their fragrance richer. The first bush she had tended herself still bloomed faithfully every year. She would touch its petals gently, as if greeting an old friend. On one such evening, as the candles flickered and dusk fell, Robert found her there. "I should have known I'd find you with the roses," he said, smiling. "They've survived everything," she murmured. "Fire, frost, neglect. Sometimes I wonder if they bloom because they pity us." He laughed softly. "No, they bloom because you taught them to." She turned toward him, her expression warm and wistful. "Do you ever think we might have loved each other differently if life had been easier?" Robert shook his head. "No, easy love doesn't last. Ours had to be earned." Her eyes glistened, and it was. He stepped closer, his hand finding the small of her back as he had done countless times before. 7 years, he said quietly. It feels like a lifetime and a breath all at once. 7 years, she echoed, and I still feel it every time you look at me. He smiled against her hair. Good, because I never intend to stop. They stood together in the half-light, surrounded by roses that had witnessed both their storms and their peace. Beyond the glass, the sky burned pink and gold, and the first stars began to appear. Later, they would return to the terrace, where their children waited to show them the garlands they had made. The boy would insist his crown was the finest. The girl would proclaim hers more beautiful, and Josephine would laugh until her eyes filled with tears. In that laughter, the house would feel alive again, alive in a way that no wealth or title could ever restore. For love, she had learned, was not the absence of hardship. It was the quiet decision, made every day, to choose one another still. When night fell, the lamps in the windows of Ashford Hall glowed like beacons across the valley. Villagers passing on the road would look up and smile, for the great house no longer seemed so distant. And sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, they swore they could hear faint music drifting from its open windows, the sound of a woman's laughter entwined with a man's low murmur, and the echo of children playing beneath the stars. It was said that the Marquis never stopped kissing his wife before everyone, and that she never stopped blushing softly afterward, as if no time at all had passed. And in that small, eternal gesture, the love that had defied cruelty, survived scandal, and conquered silence lived on, unchanged by years, unbroken by memory. For some loves, once found, do not fade. They simply deepen, until even time itself must bow before them. And so, dear listener, we close the pages of They Called Her the ugliest bride in town, but the handsome Marquis kissed her before everyone, a story not only of love, but of courage, dignity, and the quiet triumph of truth over cruelty. Josephine and Robert's journey reminds us that grace is not born in comfort, it blooms through storms. That what the world calls imperfection often hides the kind of beauty that cannot be dimmed by gossip or time. And that love, when it is built on respect and truth, can outlast even the harshest winter. Perhaps that is the heart of this tale. We are never defined by how others see us, but by the courage with which we choose to love despite it all. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, what lessons stayed with you tonight? And if you made it to the very end, write the word forgiveness below. It's the word that healed this story, and maybe, just maybe, it will touch someone who needs it today. Your support keeps these stories alive. If you wish to help our small creative team continue bringing you heartfelt historical romances, you can send a super thanks in any amount. It means the world to us. And if that's not possible, your kindness can still make a difference by simply sharing this story with a friend or loved one. Thank you for spending this time with us. Your presence, your comments, and your heart are what make this channel a little village of stories and hope. And before you go, don't miss the other tales waiting for you in the cards above. Each one filled with emotion, beauty, and the timeless promise that love, no matter how tested, always finds its way home.